Now let's talk about the third and final validity rule, which is all about distribution. As you recall, distribution is a characteristic of terms in relation to each other within a particular categorical proposition. And there's a specific pattern that the distribution follows, which you can review. I've presented it on the square of opposition because I think that's a nice way to remember it. But essentially, the distribution pattern goes like this, just as a reminder. On the square of opposition, we have, so here's our square of opposition. For A, the distribution pattern is distributed subject, undistributed predicate. For E, it's distributed, distributed. For I, it's undistributed, undistributed. And for O, it's undistributed, distributed. Again, if you need a review of the concept of distribution, you can look back at the tutorial on the concept of distribution. All right, so now let's look at the distribution rules. There are two. They both have to do with the notion of distribution, but they apply to different things. The first rule applies to the middle term. And the rule is the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. All right, let's look at an example. Here we have the middle terms in this categorical syllogism. All M is P, some M is S, therefore some S is P. To figure out whether the middle term is distributed or not, we have to look at the pattern for the type of proposition that we're looking at. So the major premise is a universal affirmative, or an A. The distribution pattern for A is distributed subject, undistributed predicate. So right there, we have passed the rule. Why? Because the middle term in the major premise, which is a universal affirmative, the middle term is distributed, and it only has to be distributed in at least one premise. So it passes the rule. But just to review, let's look at the minor premise. In the minor premise, we have some M is S. That's particular affirmative. The pattern for particular affirmative is UU. So the middle term is undistributed in the minor premise, as is the minor term. And again, whether a term is distributed or not is nothing like magically relevant to the term. It's all about the term's role in a particular categorical proposition. Either the universal affirmative, where we have a distributed subject and undistributed predicate, or one of the others that follow the pattern that we just reviewed here on the square of opposition. Now look what happens if we change the figure. And the figure is now the fourth figure, as you might recognize, right? When we change the figure, because we're using universal affirmative, and because the pattern is distributed subject, undistributed predicate, we have an undistributed middle term in the major premise, and this is still an I, some M is S, as it was in the first example. We have an undistributed middle term in the minor premise as well. So this breaks the rule being that the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. So in this case, we pass the rule because the middle term is distributed at least once. In this example, it violates the rule because the middle term is not distributed anywhere in the argument. Now let's have a look at the second rule. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in its premise. So we have two terms in the conclusion, the minor term and the major term. For either one of them, if it is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in its premise. So let's look at an example. Here we have a categorical syllogism. It's AAA, and you'll notice it's the third figure. And in the conclusion, because it's an A, what is the distribution pattern? It's distributed subject, undistributed predicate. So notice that means that the minor term is distributed in the conclusion. So what we have to do is look up at the minor term in the minor premise, which is also an A, which means the distribution pattern is distributed subject, undistributed predicate, and here we have a violation. The rule says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be in its premise, and it isn't. So that means we have a violation of the rule. Just for completeness, though, look at the predicate term. P is undistributed in this conclusion because it's an A. The distribution pattern is distributed subject, undistributed predicate. And so this predicate term doesn't trigger the rule because the rule says if a term is distributed in the conclusion. But this predicate is not, so we don't even have to look. It already passes the rule because, in a sense, it doesn't trigger the rule. So it's important to notice that the rule has, in a sense, a trigger. That's the if clause. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, then we have to look for something, right? But if it isn't, then we're done. We don't have to look for anything. But if it is distributed in the conclusion, as is the case with this minor term, then we have to look and see if the minor term in the minor premise is also distributed, because the rule is if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in its premise. Now let's look at patterns. When we violate a rule, the pattern that is created by violating a rule is named a fallacy. And so we want to look at what the fallacies are called when we break one of the distribution rules. So remember, the first rule is the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. If we break that rule, we will break it by having the middle term undistributed in both premises. And that is called the fallacy of the undistributed middle. We often just shorten that down to undistributed middle. Okay? By the same token, if a term is, if a syllogism violates the second rule about terms in the conclusion, then we have a fallacy called the fallacy of the illicit process, and then we name which term is the culprit, right? So the rule is if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in its premise. What does it take to violate that rule? It takes a term being distributed in the conclusion, but not being distributed in the premise where it's found. And so in our example, we saw that there was a minor term that was distributed in the conclusion, but was not distributed in its minor premise. So we would call that the fallacy of the illicit process of the minor term. So the term that commits the violation, that's the one that we name in the illicit process fallacy. And by the way, we often just shorten that down and call it illicit process or illicit minor, or illicit major if it's the major term that commits the fallacy. So I want to end up here by doing a quick example. How about all P is M, all S is M, therefore some S is P. Okay? So in terms of the distribution rule, what do we have? Let's look at rule number 1. A term must be distributed in at least one premise. Well, we have an A here, so that's a distributed subject, undistributed predicate. The middle term is undistributed there. In the minor, we also have an A, so that's a distributed subject, undistributed predicate, and it's undistributed here. So this commits the fallacy of undistributed middle, the fallacy of the undistributed middle, which means that it's not a valid argument if it breaks one of the rules. It's just that when it breaks a rule, we give it a name, and we call it a fallacy, right? Okay, good. Now let's look at an example of an illicit process. Suppose we have a conclusion that goes like this. Some S is not P, And for the premises, we have all M is P, some M is S. Okay, so that's a syllogism. Looks pretty straightforward. But let's investigate both of these, actually. So let's look at the distribution of the middle term. The major premise is an A, so the distribution pattern is distributed subject, undistributed predicate. That means the middle term is distributed at least once. So it checks out of the first rule, no problem. Now what about the second rule? The second rule says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then we have to check and see if it's distributed in its premise. So let's start with this. This is an O proposition, so that means we have undistributed subject and a distributed predicate. So S is undistributed, which means it checks out. It doesn't trigger the rule because the minor term is not distributed, so we don't even have to check. But what about the major term? The major term is distributed, and that means we need to look at the major term up here in the major premise. So here we have a violation. We have a distributed major term in the conclusion because the conclusion is an O, and we have an undistributed major term in the major premise. So this is the fallacy of the illicit major. And just for completeness, let me point out an additional thing about this syllogism. Remember our negation rules? The negation rule says that if there are any negations at all, there needs to be exactly one negative premise and a negative conclusion. There are negatives, here's one, and we do pass the rule because it has a negative conclusion. But look at these two premises. Yes, they're both affirmative, so this is also the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises, or the fallacy of negative conclusion. So what does this tell you? It tells you that a particular syllogistic form could commit more than one different fallacy. So if it commits two fallacies or three, it can't get more invalid than invalid. The more straightforward way to put this is that a categorical syllogism needs to pass all the rules in order to be valid. If it passes all the rules, then it's valid on the Boolean interpretation. If it fails the existential fallacy rule, but survives the negation rule and the distribution rules, then it's valid on the Aristotelian interpretation. One of the things this implies is that you can have a syllogism that is valid on both interpretations. You can have a syllogism that is valid on the Boolean interpretation. You could have a syllogism that fails the Boolean interpretation but passes the Aristotelian interpretation, or you can have a syllogism that fails on both interpretations.